He was Hollywood's golden boy, America's most trusted face of strength and redemption. But when Michael B. Jordan sat across from Stephen Colbert to promote his new film Sinners, one question changed everything. What began as light-hearted banter spiraled into a psychological ambush, broadcast to millions. By the time he stood up and stormed off set, the truth had already started bleeding through the cracks. What was he trying to hide? And more importantly, who else paid the price? Michael B. Jordan stood in front of his penthouse mirror, tux pressed, tie immaculate, but his eyes betrayed a storm beneath the calm. The room around him was pristine, glass walls overlooking Manhattan, a minimalist aesthetic that screamed control, but inside, he was anything but composed. Tonight was supposed to be another notch in his perfect run. The premiere of Sinners, a film he'd poured his soul into, followed by an appearance on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. It was the kind of night agents dream of. But beneath the surface-level glamour was a far more personal mission. Sinners wasn't just a movie, it was Michael's attempt at redemption. What the world didn't know was that the script, shrouded in fictionalization and legal vagueness, was inspired by a buried chapter from his teenage years. A chapter so painful and complicated that even those closest to him only knew fragments. The film had already earned whispers of Oscar attention, but praise felt like ash in his mouth. As his driver waited downstairs, Michael stared into his own reflection and asked himself if he was ready for what was coming. Back when he was 17, Michael had been a scholarship student at a prestigious prep school in Newark. He'd grown up on the edge of two worlds, his mother working 2 jobs in East Orange, and his afternoons spent rehearsing Shakespeare with white kids who drove German cars to school. His best friend at the time, Darius Ray, was everything he wasn't: wild, fearless, and unafraid to push boundaries. They were inseparable until one rainy night when something went horribly wrong. A girl from their school was assaulted. Evidence was flimsy. Emotions ran high. Michael was the only person who could place Darius near the scene. His testimony, hesitant and manipulated, sealed a conviction. But the truth was murkier, heavier, and Michael had spent years trying to forget it. Until the guilt started infecting everything. Now, with Sinners, he thought he could finally make peace. The film followed a rising black athlete who testifies against his own brother in a murder trial, only to discover years later that the system had used him. The story was marketed as gritty fiction, but Michael had insisted on writing every scene himself, down to the last haunting detail. He hadn't expected people to notice the parallels. He thought he'd protected Darius's identity. But as buzz grew around the film's authenticity, critics began asking uncomfortable questions. Was this story autobiographical? One journalist asked at the premiere. Michael deflected with charm. He always had. But tonight, facing Stephen Colbert's sharp wit and a national audience, the stakes felt higher. He knew Colbert had a reputation for digging deep when he sensed blood in the water. And lately, more and more interviewers had been circling the same question. What exactly inspired this movie? Michael's publicist had warned him not to go on the show. "You don't owe anyone the truth," she'd said. But that was the problem. Michael wasn't sure he could keep pretending. He thought about Darius often, especially after hearing of his death 3 months ago. Dead from a seizure in prison, a place he may never have belonged. Michael hadn't attended the funeral. He couldn't. Instead, he had poured his grief into Sinners. And now, that grief was rising like bile in his throat. As the elevator doors opened to the studio lobby, Michael blinked against the flash of cameras. The world still saw a star, a role model. But as he stepped onto the soundstage, a question rang in his ears, one he'd tried to silence for years. What if telling this story makes me the villain? The stage lights bathed the set of The Late Show in that familiar cobalt glow, where comfort and confrontation existed side by side under the mask of entertainment. The crowd's applause thundered as Stephen Colbert stepped forward, delivering his monologue with surgical precision, laughter bouncing effortlessly around the room. Backstage, Michael B. Jordan sat alone in the green room, absently staring at the screen as the host riffed about politics and pop culture. His hands were clasped tightly, knuckles pale, his smile rehearsed and ready but faltering in moments of stillness. A crew member tapped lightly on the door and signaled. "Showtime." Michael rose slowly, ran a hand over his chest to steady the beat of his heart, and walked toward the curtain. The moment he stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted, rising to its feet. Stephen greeted him with open arms, the two men embracing like old friends, though they'd never shared more than a few words off camera. The music faded, the lights dimmed just enough, and the interview began. At first, it played like any other celebrity appearance. Stephen opened with a joke about how Michael seemed to get more handsome with each role, teasing that it was unfair to the rest of the human population. Michael laughed, leaned into the charm, and responded with the ease of someone used to navigating the spotlight. They bantered about Creed, talked briefly about directing, and then pivoted to Sinners. "Now this," Stephen said, waving a DVD copy of the film, "this is not your usual blockbuster. This one punched me in the gut." Michael nodded, thanking him, his voice calm but cautious. "It's definitely the most personal thing I've ever done." The audience clapped. The word personal hung in the air like a loaded pistol on the table. Stephen pressed further, but gently. "It deals with justice, betrayal, guilt, redemption, heavy themes. Did something inspire that?" Michael inhaled sharply, just enough for the cameras to miss it. "I think we all carry things we regret," he said. "This film was me trying to work through some of mine." It was a true answer, but not a full one. Colbert smiled but didn't retreat. He leaned back, letting the silence fill the space just long enough to create unease. "There's been a lot of speculation online," he said, voice still friendly but eyes sharpening. "Reddit detectives, film critics, they're all saying this isn't fiction, that it mirrors a real case. Some even say you wrote it from memory, not imagination." The air grew taut. Michael's eyes flicked to the audience, then back to Stephen. He grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "People love to speculate," he said. "It's art. It's meant to reflect truth, even if it's not literal." Stephen chuckled, pretending to drop it. "Fair enough," he said, moving to his stack of cue cards. But Michael noticed something, Stephen's thumb tapping one particular card twice. He wasn't done. The next question was carefully crafted. "There's a moment in the film where the main character watches a childhood friend get sentenced because of his own testimony," Stephen said, his voice quieter now. "He doesn't speak up. And that guilt consumes him. That moment. It felt too real to be invented. Is there something you're not telling us?" For the briefest second, the studio held its breath. Michael's posture stiffened, his throat tightened. A bead of sweat traced a slow path from his temple to his cheek. He could feel the heat of the spotlight like judgment itself. "You ever create something to try and forget something else?" he replied, the words nearly a whisper. Stephen nodded. Serious now. "Sure. But what if the thing you're trying to forget involves someone else's life?" The question hit like a hammer dressed in velvet. The audience didn't laugh. Even the band stayed silent. Michael looked down at his lap. His hands were clenched. He knew this moment might come, but not like this. Not so soon. Not so sharp. The producers were still smiling from behind the cameras, thinking this tension was good TV. But to Michael, it wasn't entertainment, it was an ambush. He raised his head, stared directly at Stephen. "I told that story because nobody else could," he said. "And I didn't come here to be interrogated about it." There was an audible shift in the room. The audience murmured. Stephen, for the first time that night, seemed caught off guard. Michael unhooked his mic. "I think we're done here," he said, standing up. A few audience members laughed nervously, thinking it was a bit. But the look on Michael's face silenced them. He stepped off the stage without another word, disappearing behind the curtain. The camera followed him for a beat too long before cutting to a wide shot. Colbert blinked, visibly unsure what to say, then quipped, "Well, that's one way to end an interview." The band struck up music again, but the mood was irreparably broken. The internet would have its way with that clip in minutes. But Michael didn't care. He wasn't running from the truth anymore. He was walking into the fire he had started himself. Michael didn't remember walking off the set, only the feeling of his feet moving on their own, carrying him past cameras, crew, and the wide-eyed makeup girl who dropped her compact in surprise. The roar of applause had already died behind him, replaced by the cold hum of studio lights and the silence that comes only after something irreversible has happened. The hallway felt longer than it should have. His driver wasn't waiting. No one from the studio tried to stop him. They all stood stunned, frozen in the awkward aftermath of live television that had suddenly stopped being pretend. Outside, the streets of Manhattan buzzed with life, none of them yet aware of the firestorm brewing. Michael climbed into the first black SUV that looked familiar and slammed the door shut, voice sharp as he told the driver to take him anywhere but home. He needed to breathe before the headlines began. Before the texts flooded in. Before the ghosts caught up. By the time the video hit social media, cut, captioned, and viral, he was already halfway across the city, watching his own face flash across news tickers from the back of the SUV. Michael B. Jordan storms off set after Colbert Confrontation. Red one. Another clip played on mute, showing a slowed-down version of his exit with dramatic music added by some TikTok user chasing views. Even TMZ had a side-by-side comparison of his film scene and the real-life walkout. The internet was already connecting the dots. Hashtags exploded. #Sinners Truth. #Jordan exposed. Think pieces followed, written by critics who had once praised him, now dissecting every word he had said in interviews over the last 6 months. Someone unearthed a quote from an obscure magazine where Michael said, "I've seen what guilt can do to a man," and declared it an unintentional confession. Reddit threads lit up with theories, timelines, comparisons to real court cases from Newark in the mid-2000s. Within hours, someone posted a sealed juvenile court transcript. Redacted, yes, but damning in implication. Michael's phone buzzed constantly. Some texts were supportive. Others were chilling. Old friends. Lawyers. A studio executive screaming in all caps about contracts and reputations. But one message stood out. It came from a burner number. No name, no signature. Just 4 words, "You finally said it." Michael stared at it for minutes, his heart pounding like a war drum. He knew who it was. There was only one person who would send that. Darius's younger sister, Kendra. She'd been a freshman when the trial happened. She'd screamed at him in the hallway after the sentencing. Told him he was a coward. That he had chosen success over truth. That Darius had loved him like a brother and Michael had left him to rot. He hadn't spoken to her in nearly 15 years. And now she was back, with just 4 words that said everything. The guilt that had simmered beneath the surface for over a decade began to boil over. He leaned forward, forehead against the car window, watching raindrops streak like tiny trails of blame. He had thought the film would be a way to atone, quietly, artistically. But he hadn't realized that in telling the story, he had invited the world to look into a wound that never fully closed. The more they looked, the more they'd find. The parallels weren't vague anymore. They were razor sharp. The plot of Sinners followed the exact arc of Darius's case. Even some dialogue was verbatim from things Michael had said back then. How could he be so blind? Or maybe, deep down, he had wanted this all along, a punishment. A reckoning. Back at the studio, Stephen Colbert sat in his dressing room, holding the same cue card he had tapped earlier. It had one name on it. Darius Ray. His team had dug deep after noticing unusual similarities between the film and real case law. It had been meant as a soft confrontation, a chance for Michael to clarify or deny. But Stephen had misjudged the emotional weight. He never expected the reaction he got. Now, news outlets were calling him for comment, asking if the ambush had been intentional. Sponsors were nervous. Executives were whispering about damage control. But in that moment, all Stephen could think about was the look in Michael's eyes. Rage, pain, betrayal. It wasn't the look of a guilty man. It was the look of someone who had been bleeding in silence for years. Elsewhere, film bloggers began analyzing Sinners scene by scene. The courtroom sequence. The silence of the main character when asked to recant. The suicide attempt that followed. Fans now suspected that Michael had been hiding a scream inside every monologue. The public, once cheering him as an actor of substance, now saw him as something more complicated. Both a victim and a potential accomplice to injustice. Protesters appeared outside the studio demanding answers. Think pieces debated whether art should be confession or entertainment. And somewhere, a documentary filmmaker began planning a series titled The Real Story Behind Sinners. For Michael, the real storm wasn't online. It was internal. He sat alone in a hotel room that night, still wearing the same suit, still watching the same clip on loop. In the video, just before he stands, there's a flicker in his face, a moment where he almost answers the question. Where he almost confesses everything. And that, more than anything, terrified him. Because it meant the truth wasn't just trying to get out. It was already clawing its way through. By the time morning rolled around, Michael B. Jordan's face wasn't just on entertainment blogs, it had taken over mainstream headlines. The moment he stormed off Colbert's stage had metastasized into something far bigger than a viral TV incident. News outlets dubbed it the Sinner scandal. Talk shows dissected it with surgical zeal. PR analysts were invited on air to speculate whether this was a calculated publicity stunt or a career-ending meltdown. But for Michael, there was no calculation. He hadn't slept. The hotel room had become a prison cell, every surface glowing with screens blaring opinions, reactions, accusations. Outside the hotel lobby, a swarm of reporters and photographers waited, some with signs, others with microphones, all hunting the next piece of the story. They weren't asking about sinners anymore. They were demanding answers about Darius Ray. The whispers had turned into full-blown media pursuit. Multiple outlets were now circling the sealed juvenile records, hiring legal teams to petition for access. One daring outlet even interviewed the retired judge from Darius's case, an old man who admitted, on record, that the trial had been rushed, emotionally driven, and dependent on one conflicted witness. That witness, of course, had been Michael. They replayed the film's pivotal court scene next to leaked audio from a court clerk who remembered the real hearing. The similarities were no longer speculation, they were undeniable. Legal analysts called it art as evidence, a phrase that took off online. Social media turned into a courtroom. Half the world defended Michael, praising him for turning guilt into art. The other half crucified him, accusing him of exploiting a wrongful conviction to earn accolades and awards. Michael's agency called an emergency meeting. Sponsors paused deals. A streaming platform delayed the film's international release. He was advised to go quiet, lay low, issue a brief statement crafted by lawyers and PR representatives, but silence wasn't enough anymore. Especially not when a new player entered the narrative. Kendra Ray. The sister of the boy Michael had helped convict. She hadn't spoken publicly in years. But now, she posted a thread, raw, unfiltered, filled with rage and pain. She confirmed the connection. She confirmed Darius's innocence. But most damning of all, she posted a scanned copy of a letter she had found in his prison belongings. A letter Michael had written and never sent. It was dated 5 years earlier, scribbled on hotel stationery, and it was brutal in its honesty. Michael had poured his soul into those pages, admitting that he doubted what he saw that night, admitting he had felt pressure from adults to point the finger, admitting he had watched the courtroom spin a narrative he didn't fully believe. "I was scared," he had written. "Scared of ruining my future. Scared of being dragged down with you. And I've lived with that shame every day since." The letter spread like wildfire. News anchors read excerpts aloud. Celebrities commented. Civil rights attorneys took interest. Documentarians called Kendra. Even the Innocence Project reached out. Suddenly, this wasn't just a celebrity controversy. It was a potential legal reopening of a closed case. And the public was divided on whether Michael was a villain or a victim of the same system that had buried Darius. Michael watched all of this unfold in paralyzed silence. His own words, never meant to see the light, now painted across the internet like graffiti on a crumbling wall. Some defended him. Some demanded he be arrested. But the loudest voices were the quiet ones, those who had also seen friends vanish into a system that never looked back. People began sharing stories of their own regrets, their own betrayals. And in that strange collective mourning, a strange form of understanding began to take shape. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But recognition. Meanwhile, studio executives were in chaos. One insider leaked that the studio had known about the script's real-life origins but chose to market it as fiction. Emails were exposed. Damage control memos. attempts to silence journalists. It wasn't just Michael under fire. It was the entire machine that had greenlit and profited from Sinners. Awards committees debated disqualification. Activists called for proceeds to be donated to justice reform organizations. Michael's lawyer begged him to release a statement denying intentional wrongdoing, but he refused. He wasn't going to lie anymore. He had already done that once. And it had cost a man his life. Alone in that room, Michael turned off every device. Sat in the dark. No cameras. No microphones. Just silence. The storm was out there, howling, but inside, he was preparing. He had always been the actor. Always known how to deliver lines, play the part, mask the pain. But what came next wouldn't be a performance. It would be the truth, unfiltered, unguarded. And for the first time in his life, he didn't care if it cost him everything. Because some truths weren't meant to be buried. They were meant to be carried. Out loud. The truth didn't arrive in a single headline or breaking news report. It bled out slowly, like ink in water, turning everything murky until the lines between fiction and confession collapsed. While studios scrambled, lawyers debated damage control, and fans warred on social media, one relentless journalist, Clara Reyes of the Washington Ledger, refused to let the story settle into silence. She had been tracking wrongful conviction cases for years, and when Michael's story broke, something clicked. She dug deeper, not for spectacle, but for facts. Within days, she obtained a confidential interview with Kendra Ray, who provided her with key documents, a battered showbox of Darius's personal letters, and access to a sealed folder that no one outside the courtroom had ever seen. Clara's article, when it dropped, didn't scream. It whispered. But the whispers were devastating. It began with a headline that read, "Sinners wasn't fiction. It was a confession." The body of the piece laid bare everything Michael had never dared say aloud. Back in 2007, Darius Ray had been arrested after a party where a girl had been assaulted behind a school gym. There had been no DNA evidence, no clear motive, no witnesses except one, Michael. He had seen Darius leave the gym minutes before the girl was found, his shirt torn, his eyes frantic. But Darius had also been the one who'd found her. He had been trying to help, not harm. In the pressure cooker of a high-profile school, angry parents, and media vultures circling, the administration needed someone to blame, and fast. Michael had been summoned, alone, into an office where 3 adults, 2 deans and 1 detective, pressured him to tell the story that made the most sense. He didn't lie. But he didn't tell the whole truth, either. He omitted details. Let their assumptions shape his testimony. And when he took the stand, his voice shaking, he said enough to destroy his best friend. Darius was tried as an adult despite being just 16. His public defender was overworked. The trial lasted 3 days. The verdict came in less than 4 hours. Guilty. 10 years. No chance of appeal. Michael had watched from the gallery, heart pounding, hands numb, mouth dry. Afterward, he avoided the school counselor. Avoided Darius's family. Avoided mirrors. And for years, he buried the memory so deep that he convinced himself it had faded. But it never had. He graduated, moved to LA, began acting, became a star. But with every role he played, every hero, every fighter, every redeemed man, there was a part of him that still saw Darius sitting in that courtroom, handcuffed, looking back at him with eyes full of betrayal and disbelief. Clara's article included quotes from court transcripts, side-by-side comparisons between the Sinners screenplay and actual police reports, and even a photograph of Michael and Darius taken weeks before the incident. 2 boys in matching hoodies, arms slung around each other, smiles wide and carefree. It broke the internet. And with it came the final wave of reckoning. Civil rights lawyers demanded the case be reopened posthumously. The governor of New Jersey called for an independent inquiry. Old classmates posted TikToks, remembering how quickly the school moved on after Darius's sentencing. But the most haunting response came from inside the prison system itself. A former cellmate of Darius posted a video describing how Darius would sit on his bunk at night, watching Michael's movies silently, mouthing the words, still believing that his friend would one day come back for him. Michael read the article alone. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just sat in the same hotel chair he'd barely left for 3 days, holding the page like it might turn to ash. There was no denying it now. No dodging or spinning or blaming a system. He had helped convict someone he loved because he lacked the courage to tell the truth when it mattered most. And now, Darius was gone. No apologies could bring him back. No awards could make it right. Sinners had been a cry for absolution, but the world had interpreted it as entertainment. The irony was cruel. He had finally told the truth, and still, he had lied, by omission, by timing, by cowardice. But something shifted in the silence. Michael stood up, pulled out an old notebook from his duffel bag, and opened to a blank page. He began to write, not a speech, not a press release, but a letter. To Darius. To Kendra. To the boy he used to be. He wrote until sunrise, hand cramping, pages soaked with ink and memory. He didn't know what would come next. The public might cancel him. Studios might blacklist him. But none of that mattered anymore. For once, he wasn't writing for anyone else. He was writing because the truth had finally found its voice. The invitation was extended quietly, almost like a peace offering rather than a booking. Stephen Colbert's producers reached out 3 days after Clara Reyes's article broke, offering Michael B. Jordan the chance to return to the show. No script. No topics. No jokes. Just a chair, a camera, and the opportunity to say what he needed to say, unedited and uninterrupted. They knew the ratings would skyrocket, but there was more at play than viewership. It was about resolution. About confronting the moment where the world cracked open and refused to look away. Michael didn't answer right away. He spent another 2 days in silence, watching the city from behind tinted glass, fielding offers from other networks, reading thousands of messages from strangers. Some forgiving, some brutal, some simply sharing their own stories of silence and regret. But in the end, he knew there was only one place where this story began, and only one place where it could properly end. The second appearance was nothing like the first. No cheering crowd. No house band. No glitzy promo package. Just 2 chairs, a low-lit set, and a stunned sort of stillness in the air. Stephen welcomed him back with a nod, not a smile. His hands were folded, lips pressed together, eyes softer than before. "Michael," he said, "we appreciate you being here." Michael didn't nod. He just exhaled and began to speak. "I came here last week to promote a film. I left running from a truth I should have faced years ago." His voice didn't waver. It was low, gravelly, almost hoarse with exhaustion. "I made Sinners to tell a story I've never been brave enough to tell outside a script. A story about a friend. About a betrayal. About how silence can ruin a life just as much as a lie." Stephen didn't interrupt. The cameras didn't cut. Michael continued. He spoke for nearly 20 uninterrupted minutes. He told the audience about Darius, about the night everything changed, about the pressure he felt from authority figures, about the cowardice he still carried in his chest like a splinter lodged too deep to remove. He spoke about how easy it is, especially as a black teenager in white spaces, to be manipulated into compliance. About how success doesn't erase guilt, it just buries it deeper. About how every movie he'd made since Fruitvale Station had been, in some way, an attempt to rewrite the past, to play the version of himself who had spoken up. And most of all, he spoke directly to Kendra. "If you're watching this," he said, eyes glassy, "I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope you know that your brother's name is the only one that matters now." The room was so quiet, even the air seemed to hesitate. Stephen finally leaned forward. "You could have stayed silent," he said. "You had every incentive to." Michael nodded. "That's the thing. Silence is what started this. I'm done with silence." The broadcast ended not with applause, but with a fade to black. No credits. No music. Just a still shot of Darius's yearbook photo and the words "Justice demands memory" beneath it. Within minutes of airing, the segment exploded online. Viewers posted clips with the hashtag #NoMoreSilence. Major networks replayed it in full. Teachers played it in classrooms. Churches projected it during Sunday services. Civil rights groups used it as a rallying cry. But the most unexpected response came from Kendra herself. She posted a video from her kitchen table, holding the letter Michael had written to Darius. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She simply said, "He didn't have to do that. But he did. And that means something." She paused, then added, "But it doesn't mean it's over." Her words resonated louder than any press statement ever could. She wasn't offering closure. She was offering a challenge. That justice wasn't about a single moment of truth, it was about ongoing accountability. About how people in power, even ones who never asked for it, have a responsibility to the stories they shape. In the days that followed, the ripple effects intensified. The governor formally reopened Darius's case as part of a broader investigation into juvenile convictions from that era. A foundation was launched in Darius Ray's name to provide legal aid to at-risk youth. Michael declined any official role in it. He donated anonymously. He refused interviews. He disappeared from the red carpets, pulled out of award season, and retreated from the spotlight. For the first time in over a decade, he chose to live quietly. Not to hide, but to listen. To rebuild. And yet, even as the headlines moved on and new scandals replaced old ones, the story of Sinners remained embedded in the cultural memory. Not because it won awards, it didn't. Not because it was a box office smash, it wasn't. But because it marked a rare, raw moment when a man told the world something ugly about himself not to gain sympathy, but because the weight had simply become too heavy to carry alone. Years later, film students would study the film not as fiction, but as testimony. Schools would debate its ethical implications. And somewhere, in a quiet room where sunlight filtered through dusty blinds, a young actor would open a script with trembling hands and ask the question Michael B. Jordan had finally dared to answer. What happens when the truth isn't enough to save you, but you speak it anyway?